Right here, and welcome my good friend David Stone. Thanks for coming on Turf Tuesdays, David.
Absolutely. Glad to be able to hopefully help somebody out.
Well, and I appreciate the opportunity to be in one of the cottages, right? I mean, I think when I emailed you, I said, what we really need is a quiet space with a good internet connection to talk about your career in turf. And we're going to talk a lot about your career at the Honors. And you said, I got a perfect space. We'll get one of the cottages on property. So this is just great. This is just great. Before we jump in, I have 100 questions about the honors. I have joked with several that, this here logo, if you work in the golf industry, is probably more recognizable for Tennessee than the TriStar flag. Uh, but before we get into that, I shared with you earlier, we have a lot of superintendents from Tennessee will be listening to this. But we have a lot of extension agents in Tennessee. And one of the things in UT Extension, we've had a lot of turnover where we have new people that have matriculated into those extension roles. So they might not be familiar with you. We've got a lot of lawn care folks who listen in that might not be familiar with you and your career in golf and your linkages to UT. And then we've got superintendents in other states that join us. I mean, if you can believe it, David, we have pesticide credits for Hawaii for today's session. So we have some folks that are up bright and early on the islands to get their accreditation for the Department of Ag in Hawaii.
One of them
So
might be Ryan Boris.
it could be.
He worked here one summer. He's the superintendent in Hawaii.
It could be. So for those folks, give them a little background about, who you are, how you got involved in turf, and just how you got started.
Well, maybe I'll try not to take too long.
We have an hour. You can go. I'm here. I'm here to listen.
Way back when I was probably 12 years old, I got invited to one of my friends' birthday parties. And out in his yard, they had a few 4-inch tin cans sunken in the ground, and we played putt golf. And I thought, well, that's a lot of fun. And so I got started, got a few golf clubs and started hitting around. We lived on a farm, and I'd go to play golf at the public course, and I'd see a worker out there, and I'd ask him questions about the grass. And so I started trying to make me a little practice area at the farm with a green and everything.
Okay.
And then I transferred to a little larger school because they announced they were going to have a golf team. And so transferred there and played golf for 3 years on the golf team. And read an article maybe in one of the golf magazine or Golf Digest that people were starting to go to universities, college, getting degrees in agronomy to be golf course superintendents. And I thought, that's something I think I would like to do. And so that's what got me started, and went to the real UT in Knoxville, and got a degree in horticulture.
Okay.
And then before I got out of college, my first job on the golf course was at the first Tennessee State Park golf course, Henry Horton,
Okay.
in Chapel Hill, Tennessee.
I've been there.
And so that was my start. And then after college, I started working at what then was Crockett Springs National Golf and Country Club in Brentwood. And later, a few years later, it was sold and it's now Nashville Golf and Athletic Club. But I became superintendent there after a couple of years, and I stayed 4 years there. That was 74
Okay.
through most of 77, and had some people from Holston Hills come and play Crockett Springs, and the greens were really good, bent grass greens, and so they wound up hiring me to come to Holston Hills and try to improve that golf course. So went there, and fairways didn't have a lot of Bermuda in it, but we first after 1 year we had in pretty good shape with Bermuda grass again, and changed to management on greens, and so I was there 5 years, and I was beginning to kind of do a little history of Holston Hills, reading a lot about it, and went to the library and studied Donald Ross's notes and stuff. And I was kind of thinking, well, I might be here for a long time. And out of the clear, one July morning, Saturday morning, John Wiley was the head golf professional. He called me and he said, Pete Dye's son wants to come and play golf today and bring a couple of guys. They're building the honors course. And I'm not even sure I'd even heard about it at that time. But he said, would you like to play with them? And so I played with them on that Saturday, right after lunch, I believe. And they told me a little bit about the honors course, but not a lot. And so kind of blew it off and went from there. And then in late September of 1982, I get a call from PB Dye and saying that they'd interviewed a couple of people for the job, and either Pete or Jack didn't care for him and wanted to know if I'd be interested in coming down. And I said, well, I'm pretty happy here, but I'd love to talk to Pete Dye. He just got through doing the TPC sawgrass, and I loved his style of natural areas and stuff. And so I said, I'll come down. And I really wasn't thinking that there'd be a great chance that I would leave Holston Hills. But seeing the course under construction at that time, I could tell immediately that this is way more than I've seen before and what I've been accustomed to. I could tell it was going to be special. And at that time, the interest rates were extremely high. They were like 18%.
Oh boy.
Yeah, and it's well, anyway. So I go around the course for 2 or 3 hours with Pete. Him asked me lots of questions, this, that, and the other, and he'd stop and talk to some of the workers. So he gets through and he said, well, you want the job? Just like that. I thought that's the strangest interview I've ever had. And I said, well, I won't even consider it unless they put me a house on the property. I figured, well, that'll be the end of that. So he said, well, I'll run that by Mr. Lupton. And so a couple of days later, Pete calls me. He said, Mr. Lupton wants to meet you. And so we arranged for a Sunday afternoon. I meet Jack Lupton at the clubhouse that was under construction. And one of the first things he said was, I think it's an excellent idea for you to have a house on the property. And and we walked down to the 18th green, and he told me that, he said, I understand that this area is one of the tougher places to grow grass. So that put me at ease in that some people would think, well, you can just throw enough money at anything and you can cure all ills, but you can't change climate.
Right.
You have to deal with that. So I took the job, and it was a tough job. Pete liked to do things that were out of the ordinary, and they chose Jamestown creeping red fescue for all the roughs.
Whoa.
And that was a terrible failure. And so we had to redo that. And then the very first winter I'm here, we have the coldest winter we've had ever since I've been down here. And I mean, and it got below zero on Christmas Eve, and it killed a lot of the fairway grass. And so here I am, I've got roughs that are terrible, and then fairway grass that's not good. And but that got us to move on to zoysia grass, because Pete had put some zoysia grass in front of all the greens, just a little bit, or in some cases maybe 60 feet, but most time 10 or 15 feet. But that zoysia did not winter kill. And so it took a while, but we convinced Mr. Lupton that the thing to do was to sod the fairways in zoysia.
Okay.
And a couple of 3 years later, he said that's the best decision we ever made.
Yeah.
And, but that's how it started.
So I mean, there's so many things to unpack in that. The first thing I want to ask a question about is you talked about playing golf with PB Dye at Holston, and they shared kind of the vision or the concept for what they wanted the honors to be at that time, right? It was a newer thing, not what it is today. Can you share a little bit about like what they shared with you, right? To make this a job that I mean, at some level, you're at a historic Donald Ross property in Knoxville, the town of your alma mater. You talked about maybe that's a place you never thought you might leave. When they shared that vision to you, like what did they share to get you to pique your interest?
I don't think it was the vision that they shared with me that day. It's the vision I saw when I came down here for the
Okay.
visit.
Gotcha.
That was pretty much it.
Gotcha. What so like what did you see? I mean, at that point was the what the property, I'm assuming, right? Could be wrong, like the quarters were cleared, maybe there's some rough grading done, or was it further along than that even?
It was further along than that. Actually, they had just planted the greens.
Okay.
Yeah, the bent grass was just barely up. And some of the fairways were still growing in, and but the amount of movement,
Hmm.
the extensive rock work around the lakes, the railroad ties around the seventh, along the wall of the seventh
That's
fairway
a
on the
PB
left
dice.
side.
It's a PB die
The
signature.
Pete Dive deal. That's right. Yeah, I could just tell that it's going to be a course unlike anything else in Tennessee because so that's it.
Yeah.
And
So, one of the things that I think is important in the moment we're in today in golf, and we talked about this earlier, that in my time in this business, the first, gosh, man, I started at Tennessee in 2008. And for the better part of a decade, maybe a decade and a half, there was no movement, right? People were in jobs and they weren't really moving. And in recent years, maybe the past 18 months or so, there's tremendous movement with job openings at blue blood clubs and just marquee facilities really all across the country. And one of the things in the story that you shared that resonates with me was you're at a club and you're really comfortable, you're feeling really good about where things are at and the improvements that you'd made at Holston, and then you jumped to come here. Can you talk a little bit about the the process of making that decision, right? Of leaving your comfort zone to going into something new, um, that would be real significant.
well, like I said, the change here and the different grasses and it's fun when you learn, when
Right.
you keep learning. And so if I'd have stayed at Wholesome Hills, it would pretty much been same grasses, and uh, maybe we'd have redone greens or something like that and put a different bent grass there. But I just felt like uh, that down here there was just that, and Jack Lupton told me, I believe he said that first day, he said, "This is not a stopping off point. This is an end point," and and I could see that how that very well could be, and who wouldn't want to be a part of that
Right.
in a Pete Dye golf course, and he was a hot architect at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. For
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, sometimes I think when you move around and you take two or three different jobs, you do learn at each one. Some things that worked really well for me at Crockett Springs and Nashville when I moved to Holston Hills didn't work so good.
Hmm.
And and then I come down here and I have new challenges to figure out. And so if you want to move up in your career, making a two or three moves is a great way to learn because if you stay at the same place, well, you got 20 years experience or you got one year 20 times.
Right. Right. No, that makes sense. And I think the other thing is you instilled that into the people who work for you, right? That you had some really, really talented folks that were, part of your coaching tree, if you will, that studied under you here and have since moved on to other places. And um, that I think has become kind of a signature, right, of your time here. That people put their 3 to 4 years in, went off to another place, and continued to move forward. And I mean, can you share for the group listening, some stories of maybe names that we know that when they were younger and came down here to cut their teeth with you, whether if Trey Cutshaw's on, maybe we can tell an embarrassing Trey Cutshaw story today. I don't know. But certainly Nelson Carone and Josh
Okay.
Cook and Jeff Huber and many, many others. I mean, your
Well,
coaching tree is deep.
well, my first assistant down here was Courtney Young,
Okay.
and Courtney worked one summer for me at Holston Hills. And so brought him down here, and then he moved on to what's now Windstone in Chattanooga for a few years, and then he went to Atlanta to Setting Down Creek
Right.
in 1989, I think, and he's still the superintendent there.
Yep.
Uh, so that was good. Jeff Hollister at Chattanooga Golf and Country Club. He's probably been there 30 years now.
Hmm.
Uh, Jeff Huber, the Golf Club of Tennessee. Uh, Dave Frichte was here in the late 80s. He went to Pine Needles and he is still there.
Yep.
Uh, Gosh, we had Chris Sykes, we had Scott Wicker. Scott's in chemical and fertilizer sales now, but he was superintendent for several years. And Travis Levings, who was a superintendent at Karsten Creek in Oklahoma for a long time, still there. Then Nelson came about 2004, I think, and he was a really good one. Went on to the Ford plantation, and now is at Seminole, and
Hmm.
some little course somewhere down in South Florida.
Little
Uh,
Donis Rock track, Donald Ross
that's right.
track.
But all those guys, if you hire good people like that, they'll make you better, and you can learn some things from them. But I gave them a lot of responsibility too, and we'd have lots of conversation. I can remember a lot of times Nelson coming in, and we'd argue over this and that and the other, not in a bad way, but he'd have an idea and I'd have a different idea. Maybe we'd see eye to eye, but we both came out a lot better for it.
Right.
And we always did a lot of experimentation, and I involved the assistants in that very much.
Yeah, no, and that, again, those I think lessons learned under you are moving forward today. You mentioned Jeff Huber earlier, and I think I shared with you that now my colleague Dr. Bowling and I and Dr. Horvath, we're doing a bentgrass variety trial at the Golf Club of Tennessee, and Jeff's really been managing that and leading it on property and kind enough to give the nursery space to do that. And he put out the orange and white numbered placard signs on each plots for us to take pictures, and was there and asked him, where did you get those? He goes, well, this is what we used to do down at the honors when we were evaluating grasses.
We did 27 bentgrass varieties in 1991 down here. And so absolutely. And having the trials at a place that has the year-round budget to maintain them like real golf greens is a real advantage too.
Yeah.
You can get really good feedback on how they're going to perform.
Well, and I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, as a university researcher, I remember when I was a grad student, so Pete Lanscoot was on my graduate committee at Penn State. One of the things that he would drill into me was that, uh, we do our best as researchers at a university setting to simulate what golf course conditions would be, but it's a simulation. It's never going to be the same because one, we don't have the resources to manage to that level of
Absolutely.
intensity.
Right.
And two, our tee sheet is zero and we have no shade. You're not going to find a tree on the research farm. I mean, just some of the other microclimate factors aren't the same. So I think the ability to look at them under more realistic conditions is just invaluable. And I think it'll help us as researchers understand how the grasses perform and what fits there might be in this market. And I think it'll help them, at the golf club, make a decision that if they're going to pull the trigger on a renovation to resurface and they want to go with bentgrass, what are the ones that might fit best at in their situation?
Yep, absolutely.
And I think that kind of segues into another question I had, David, that I think right now, and this has probably been true forever, really, like, the old AJ Powell joke was that in the transition zone, we can grow all the grasses equally poor, right? But I think with where we're at in golf and there's been new constructions, renovations, restorations, whatever name you want to put on it. I think the topic of grass selection is as pertinent as ever. Um, Talk a little bit about, kind of your theory on grass selection. If you were going to go to a new course, right, and guide them on grass selection, like how would you go about getting them to do that, to get the grass that was right for them?
Obviously, it depends on the climate they're in.
right?
If they're in, say, Oklahoma, it gets a lot colder there and drier than it does in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So, whereas Bermuda greens now are doing really well in the Chattanooga area, uh, there's still a lot of bent grass in Oklahoma.
Hmm.
And when Josh Cook, who was an assistant here, went out to Oak Tree as a superintendent, he said it was easier to grow bent grass in Oklahoma than it was here in Tennessee because they have a lot more air movement.
Yeah.
And uh, conversely, it's harder to grow Bermuda grass greens out there than it is here. So the climate is going to dictate an awful lot.
Hmm.
Uh, More than anything, yeah, you've got owner preferences or this and that and the other, but it all comes down to what can we grow here, perform well. It's one of the real frustrations for me all through my career, and there's no great way to solve it. Uh, Although I did try it with overseeding, even on Georgia Fairway, uh, is up north, say in Ohio and Michigan, once spring breaks, their fairways and roughs, they're all full.
Hmm.
They're good. They're close to summertime condition right away. And in this part of the South, the Bermuda grass totally dies back in the wintertime and it starts over. And even if you have a very mild, warm spring like this one has been, it's Bermuda grass is not going to be in summertime condition till summertime.
Right.
It takes warm temperatures, and for people, so if you have a national club where they belong northern states and they come down and they wonder why the grass is not as good here in April as it is up north, and that's that has always been a thing that's been frustrating to me.
Yeah. Friend of mine, Tyler Guy, who's the director up at Signal Mountain, he likes to joke that golf courses in Tennessee are like flights to Atlanta. It takes forever to get up to cruising altitude, and as soon as you're there, you're getting ready to land.
There's a lot of truth in that.
Which I thought was a beautiful metaphor.
It
And
really
really,
is.
really funny, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah, just really funny. But so, I mean, I think with that, I think I heard you say once, and this is kind of related, that um, once you get the environment piece right and you narrow things down, there's a case to be made for picking the grass that gives you the best performance. If you have 365 days in a year, you want to pick the grass that gives you the best uh, performance for the biggest bulk of that,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a layer to that of overlaying that with a golf calendar too to make sense of
Yeah.
uh, when you need to be good. I asked a director over in the Carolinas last week. I was with the USGA green section. When do you need to be good? And the answer is it can't be every single day, right? Yeah, you can't peak all the time. You've got to identify some peak periods. And
That's right.
he spoke to the shoulder season periods that you referenced earlier, which I think is true in a lot of places in this part of the country.
Zoysia fairways will not heal divots as fast as Bermuda grass. It's just a fact. And so if you've got a place that's going to get 40,000 rounds of golf a year, is Zoysia grass right for you? Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's all fair. Switching gears a little, one of the things that I think um, you've seen a lot of changes with pest management on golf courses over your career. And, I think one of those that you were a real leader in was Bermuda grass management in Georgia, because when you made your conversion, that became uh, a significant hurdle, right, to get over. And it still is a significant hurdle today. We've got some newer technology that has been really helpful and with recognition as a tool. But talk a little bit about the iterative process of going about trying to meet that challenge.
Okay, so like I said, I talked the owner after a couple of years into switching from Bermuda grass fairways to Zoysia grass. And at that time, nobody had resodded all the fairways. And you didn't have big rolls back then. You had little small pieces. Anyway, it cost $500,000. And so we sod the fairways, and a couple of years later, I started seeing all this Bermuda come up through there. I said, golly, I'm in trouble now. I've caused him to spend all this money, and we're gonna have Bermuda fairways again in a few years if we
Yeah.
can't do something. And certainly there was nothing on the market to kill one grass out of another like that. There wasn't much demand for it. So I got a big ag chemical book, and I looked through every herbicide, and if it even listed Bermuda grass control on it, I said, I want to get a little bit. We wound up putting two benches, and they had a total of 40 pots each. They were 1 gallon pots. They had a 4-inch plug of zoysia grass and a 4-inch plug of Bermuda that we'd taken out of the fairways here. And I started screening these different chemicals, and we mixed it up, the different ones in a Windex bottle, believe it or not, and and it, as you can imagine, it took extremely small amounts.
Right.
But anyway, we screened 40 different products, and 3 of them showed some promise. Some of the things we did kill both of them.
Right.
Some didn't kill either one of them, but it turned out that Fusilade was the one that gave us the best of knocking back the Bermuda without overly damaging zoysia grass. And so we started testing strips and fairways, and then eventually spraying them all. And that became a regular thing. We'd spray about 3 times a year in the summertime. And to tell you how hard Bermuda grass is to get rid of, we had a certain area on number 1 fairway before we get to the green, a little low place, and it would look like 100% Bermuda. And it was almost as big as this room here, maybe half as big as this room. And I told the guy, I said, every time I see a little bit of Bermuda start to come back in that area, I'm gonna have you spray it again. It took 3 years of doing that before no more Bermuda came back. That was a Fusillade.
Yeah.
And I would imagine it would be similar with Roundup, to be honest, because everybody knows that you're not going to get rid of Bermuda grass with Roundup in 1 year.
Right.
It's going to come back the next year. But but sometimes you just have to solve your own problems. There's nobody else to solve them. We did that, and then we did testing at one time, controlling brown patch and zoysia grass was a big problem too. But we screened a bunch of chemicals, and then before ProStar was on the market, they gave me some product, and we tried it and some strips in the fairway. In fact, Jeff Huber was a superintendent here, and it worked terrific. And so that's just a matter of you got a problem, you got to solve it. That's what you're paid
Well,
for.
and it obviously resonates with me as somebody who does research for a living. And I think it's just so relevant because I think the problems always change,
They
right?
do, absolutely.
And you might not be able to get a clear-cut answer because the problems are evolving. And if you're one who values continue learning, you also might be wanting to know how a new strategy will perform at your site on a problem that's well understood. And I can think, I'll brag on Josh a little because you brought him up. He this year they overseed at his property now, and he really wanted to lean into, let's call it, a West Coast transition program, where the East Coast transition of overseeded ryegrass is very dramatic, right? We'll put a group 2 herbicide down at a heavy rate. We spray out the ryegrass. It doesn't look awesome, and then eventually the Bermuda grass fills back in. Well, the superintendents out in the West that overseed every year, and their whole business model is really shoulder season golf on overseed. They've approached it a very different way, where they'll use lower rates of herbicides that are they're active on ryegrass, but not nearly as active as what a full rate of Katana or Monument would be. And they'll use lower rates combined with lower mowing heights. And it's kind of this slow bleed of the ryegrass is hurt, but not hurt so bad that it's really visual to the player, but it's not really growing. So its competition against the Bermuda grass is less. The reduction in cutting height kind of favors the Bermuda grass over the ryegrass as well. And the net is you never really have a surface that looks off,
Terrible.
right?
Hmm.
You've slowly transitioned from one grass to the other, and you know, he didn't know how this would respond at Birmingham, right? Because I mean, this is all information from Scottsdale, and if you've ever been to Birmingham or if you've ever been to Scottsdale, Scottsdale's not Birmingham, and Birmingham's not Scottsdale.
Huge difference.
And so he, to his credit, he went out and I think they mixed up tanks of sapphire, and I think they put out 1 ounce and 2 ounces and 4 ounces and ate to find the rate that was going to be right for them. And then they went forward with that. And, and he commented that it was a real learning experience for the assistants there that to go through that process, but then they saw the value.
You're talking about fairways, right?
Sorry, my fairways,
Okay.
yeah.
For years here, we overseeded our Bermuda roughs.
Which it led to an awesing contrast, by the way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we never had a transition problem. And I did not, in fact, I'm not sure even any of the chemicals were known to take out the ryegrass at that time. We just let nature take its course. But I think the biggest mistake years ago that people would make was, well, we're going to run it dry because that's going to stress the ryegrass. Well, it's the other way around. You need to give it everything to make the Bermuda grass grow. And what happens to the ryegrass in this climate is a dollar spot starts working on it, and then brown patch. And
Right.
you get into June, and it would take out the ryegrass in our roughs, just like you're talking about, very gradual. And we never had a transition issue. And
Yeah.
we did it several years.
And I think this year, the folks that are listening with us in Tennessee, I mean, I think everybody can speak to a dry spring leading to slow Bermuda grass because we've seen that statewide. I mean, it's been very, very dry, not only in our state, but the region.
That's right.
And
That's right.
our Bermuda's been pretty slow, kind of across the board from public facility to super high end private. It's been slow, kind of slow everywhere. But that's just the nature of being in, as AJ Powell was saying, this is where we can grow all the grasses equally poorly.
Long time ago, when Kim Lawn was just getting in the lawn care business, they avoided areas where there were more than one kind of grass grown, where people had Bermuda lawns and fescue lawns. They stayed away from those areas. They initially worked further south where there was Bermuda and further north where it was bluegrass.
Yeah, that's because those situations are asking for chemical mishaps, right? Where one tank goes out and
Yeah,
you're just asking for a mistake to be
that's
made.
right. And they knew too that the fact that there were two different kind of grasses being grown, that there wasn't any one great answer.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, I had Pat Rose on last month, and Pat. Pat used to work for you.
Pat worked some summers here, had
And
some part-time in the spring and fall too.
and
When he was in high school, he had a putting green in his yard. He overseeded it, mowed it, walking green door. It looked terrific.
he one of the things he talked about was, I ask everybody, I'm going to ask you this question later, about biggest changes in turfgrass, since 1970 or 1975. And he went on and on about the moisture meter and our modern TDR moisture meters. And, we talked a little bit about how, that's kind of the evolution of the method you started here with the Barlow knife. And for those that maybe are unfamiliar, can you talk a little bit about how you were training assistants to monitor moisture in greens before we ever had the fancy purple TDR probe or now the blue USGA probe to stick in the ground and get a number?
When I was on the crew at Crockett Springs, my first job out of college, we had problems with isolated dry spots on greens. And they had me checking the greens every day. And we saw the spots and I just determined, well, there's got to be some way that you can figure out when it's getting dry. And I came up with the idea of sticking a knife blade in the green. And if it was super hard, then it's getting dry.
Mm-hmm.
And so I came up with, okay, I can go around and I can test the firmness and I'll know if this section of the green over here is much harder than the other, it's drier. And we're going to need to put water in this area to even it up during the day, or we're going to have some problems. And took that to Holston Hills, brought it down to the honors course. And then it might have been Huber that came up with the, well, we need some way to quantify the moisture. And we started feeling how much moisture was in the knife blade. And we had a rating system for it, 1 through 5.
Okay.
I'm sorry, 1 through 5 was the firmness.
Okay.
5 was brick hard.
Okay.
All right. We had A, B, C, and D. I think D was dry, no moisture. We did.
Okay.
You'd stick a knife blade in the green, pull it out, feel the knife blade, you can feel a bit of moisture.
Okay.
And 2 was pretty darn wet, and 3 was in the middle. And so we had a certain number. We tried a 3C was a good compromise of the right amount of firmness. Now that was for average blade. If we had a tournament now, we'd want them 4.
Okay.
We'd want them harder.
Right.
But a 3C had enough moisture in it that we weren't going to have to syringe them during the day, but they weren't going to be overly wet, they weren't going to be overly dry. And yeah, that, and now they use moisture meters, and I assume that maybe the moisture meter even shows on the map when you get back to the office where the green was drier, or maybe the
I
next.
think the USGA one has a mapping capability
I figured it might, but we would come in after we checked the greens and just our memory, we have a map of each green, and we'd color in. If it was super dry, we'd color it red. If it was a little drier than average, it was yellow. And so that's the way we knew. Then the guy got the sheet the next morning. He goes out and he hand waters the yellow areas or the red areas.
Okay.
In fact, the red areas, we might have to go back out the same day and water.
Right.
All right. So it might be that close to wilting.
Right. And the thing that's so cool about that, right? I mean, and I think folks often get impressions about bent grass and what it can and cannot do that I don't sometimes aren't really ground truthed in reality, or maybe they're ground truthed in scar tissue of having done it wrong and having to pay the price for that. But what I hear in that is you get your work done in the morning, right? If you can make sure that the moisture in the root zone is right going into the morning, then you're not going to be out there pulling hoses throughout the afternoon in most circumstances. There's always exceptions, right? But most of the time, your work is done in the morning to set you up to get through the afternoon.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. They're not going to go from good shape to terrible in a few hours. But if, for instance, one of the controllers didn't come on and that green didn't water that morning, you could be able to tell the difference between it and the other. Say something going on here. This green's significantly firmer and drier than the others.
Well, and then the beauty of that too is, I think we're in a world where we have more data than we ever had, and really you could make an argument that we know what to do with, if we're being real honest, right? We can measure things that we don't know what to do with the measurements. Right. And sometimes there can be a propensity to like almost get lost, particularly with younger people, to get lost in the numbers and forget that to me, the most important part of that data collection process is physically being on the green, right? And
when you're looking at it every day, you see changes,
right?
And yeah, you're in tune to that. This doesn't look quite right. Even before grass wilts, it looks a little bit different than the grass that's really in good shape. So yeah, being out there on it there's no substitute for that.
Yeah.
It's amazing. When I first got in the business, you remember the bottle of Dr. Pepper and had a clock on it? What did that clock say? It had 10, 2, and 4. And the idea was they wanted you to drink a Dr. Pepper at 10, 2, and 4. Well, a lot of people use that to water greens. And they would go out in the daytime and they'd have a guy go out and syringe off the greens at 10 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 4 in the afternoon. And you know what they talked about all the time? What a problem Pythium was.
Wow. Yeah.
They kept them too wet.
Yeah. No, that's so funny. And I didn't know that about the Dr. Pepper bottle though on your irrigation schedule.
Occasionally I'll still see a Dr. Pepper's logo or an ad, and you can still see that clock on it. But 10, 2, and 4 And you tell superintendent say, I syringe my greens by the Dr. Pepper method.
Well, if Tom Samples is listening, he just smiled because that's a man who likes a Dr. Pepper. So that's good stuff. While we're here, and before I forget, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bring up our code for GCSAA so folks can get their GCSAA certification points. I'm gonna pull this down to May. So if you are a golf course superintendent and you are interested in GCSAA CEUs, this is your code that you will enter into the GCSAA website to get your CEUs. While we leave this up, we did have a question in the Q&A box. And the question, David, was what's the most underrated skill of a golf course superintendent?
Not being too sensitive.
Okay.
Uh, I had an honors member here not long ago tell me he was on the Greens Committee at a club in Georgia. And he made us a pretty simple comment or about the golf course to the superintendent. And he said the guy just got so tore up about it. He was texting him at 10 o'clock at night, you know, complaining about that. A lot of these members they don't know our business very good. And you just, you can't be that sensitive. Uh, we used to have a term. You got to be able to tell them to go to hell in such a way that they look forward to the trip.
Everybody listening, remember that one.
Yeah,
That's genius.
yeah. You just they don't mean as much by as you think, and I know how it is. You're out there and you're dealing with problems, and somebody complains about something, and it grades on you. But you've got to get to the point to where you don't let that happen. But I will say that don't just be a position either. Be a person. Be around the members if you can, so you can explain to them why the grass is not this and not that. Why it's not great as good in March as it is in July. Why is it not as good in April as when I last played in October of last year? You have to sell yourself, and you can't. Another term, you can't go around poking people in the eye and expect them to like you.
Yeah,
And it's easier for them to fire the position than it is the person.
that is the truth. And I've heard you say that before, and I'm glad you brought it up here because that's the truth. And I'll say that that's something that you did when you were here. It is very impressive, the relationships you cultivated with the memberships when you were here. I mean, I can remember being here with you when I first started at UT, and every member knew you and you knew them and you knew things about their families and their kids and you really worked really hard to cultivate those relationships and did it in a high pressure job with a lot on the line where it would be long hours and it would be easy to sit down in the shop and take a breath and not do that, but that's as big a part of the job as any. And I mean, I'll be completely transparent with you. You must have done it at Holston too, because we played golf last year, and you would have thought I brought a rock star on property with me. I mean, the amount of people who came up to us to say hello and shake your hand, and you remembered all of them. I mean, it was really impressive. So yeah, that's wise words there. Well, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull this um, GCSAA code down. If anybody needs that code, they can email me and I will give it to them if they didn't capture it while we were live together. But in our concluding time here, David, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Pat, and you've been at the business a lot longer than Pat was, right? So you have
Yes.
a bigger data set to pull from. But if you look back 1975 or in 2026, that's a little over 50 years. Lots changed, right, in the way we go about managing turf on a golf course. And in your opinion, what's the biggest change and why?
No question, it's the height of cut on greens and the speed of greens.
Okay.
1974, when I took over Rocket Springs, everybody mowed greens, bent grass greens at a 1/4 inch. Now, people don't know what that is. If you're using the numbers we use today, that's 250.
Wow. Yeah.
Now we're mowing at 100, and a lot of times. Okay, so we're mowing at a 1/4 inch, 250, and I lowered the mowers when I took over to 3/16. And one of the superintendents and one of the higher up clubs in Nashville called me. He said, that'll be as low as you can ever cut them. Uh, and I think I'm right on this. The stemp meter, of course, was invented back in the 30s, but it came into use really somewhere in the mid to late 70s. And the USGA started, before they sold the stemp meter, they started checking some greens at various places. And I believe they said that the average stemp meter reading at that time was 6.5. And I know they put out when they started selling the stemp meter, they put out this sheet of different speeds, and 10 feet was considered US open speed.
Wow.
And now the greens here at the honors usually are about 12.5, sometimes 13.
For daily play.
Daily play. And you watch the PTA tournaments all the time, and even some of the amateur college events or ladies tournaments or whatever. And the greens are not, yeah, they're good. They're 12, they're running 12 on the stamp. I mean, that's a huge difference. And of course that puts tremendously more stress on the grass than it used to.
And would you say that, part of that is the equipment had to change to meet that need?
Yes. Used to when I was first in the business, and for a long time, if you verticut greens or groomed greens, that was a separate operation. In other words, you put a riding greens mower out with groomers on them, and we'd groom them once a week, and then you'd come behind it with a riding mower, or later on at a more higher end course, walking mowers and mow them. But the separate operation, and then the groomers came out where the groomer sat just behind the front roller, and so you could groom and mow all the same operation. You could groom 7 days a week if you
Yeah.
if you wanted to.
Yeah. No, and it's amazing how those changes, and now we think about the weight of the mowers we use today, and just the advancement in mower technology is unbelievable. And I mean, I don't, maybe I'm too much of a doubter. I don't know that we're ever going to have robots mowing greens, at least in my lifetime. But the adoption of that sort of technology for roughs, I think, is really interesting. And when Pat was on last month, they had just put those in at Belmead to maintain roughs. And his thought was then they can reallocate that labor to more tightly mown uh, surfaces that require more detail, and the golfers are going to interact with more.
All of this mowing and grooming and sand top dressing and lightweight mowers too has increased the maintenance cost of equipment tremendously. For one, you've got to have one or more mechanics that are really, really good. We used to lap the greens mowers once a week, and then here at the honors, the mechanic checked them every single day after mowing, and they ground a whole lot more frequently than used to. When it had fairway mowers or gang mowers, and you mowed fairways about 3/4 of an inch, and the blades on those reels were very thick. And they'd get ground once a year in the wintertime when you tear them down. These lighter weight mowers, the reels thickness of the blades is much thinner too, so they wear out faster, they dull faster, so they require a lot more maintenance. So that has upped the cost of golf. I will say that.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. And I can, thinking about that maintenance, it takes me back to a conversation I had many years ago with a gentleman we both know well, Rodney Lingle, and he used to joke about how, the putting surface is the canvas and the mower's kind of the paintbrush. So
Oh,
if you're going to go
that's
paint a
right.
picture, you better have that brush ready to do the work you want it to do.
Rodney revolutionized bent grass greens.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. Uh, this goes along a little bit with having a long career and not being sensitive. But there was a caddy here at the honors, and I guess the year was 2005 or 6, and came up to me and he said, I know your greens here have been really good. He said, but I played a tournament at Memphis Country Club. He said, those greens were better than I ever saw these greens here. Well, you could get offended by that,
Right.
or you could look into it and say, if somebody is that much better than what I'm doing, I need to figure out
Yeah.
what it is and what we can do about it. And that's what got me interested in Bermuda grass greens here. And I started going around and playing a few of the courses here at Bermuda Greens. And I'd go over to Bear Trace here in Chattanooga, and I'd come back and tell members, I said, his greens are better than I can make these greens. And they didn't believe it. And it took 2 or 3 years to convince the membership. In fact, we put a green out here. We took one of our greens and we killed the bent grass on it, and we planted all three varieties of the Bermudas that were available at that time.
Yeah, I remember.
And we started taking members out there on a Saturday afternoon after they'd finished their round and having putt on them. And they'd say, I just didn't know Bermuda could be that good.
Yeah.
But, it's important to go visit places, to visit other golf courses, to visit other superintendents. You can learn a lot. And when members come back and tell you, I played such and such course and it was really good, maybe it doesn't apply at all to you because it's different grass. But at least don't get offended.
Well, no, for sure. And it gets back to what you opened with, right? And that, what's right for a club is very specific for that club. And you talked about a gentleman going out playing an amateur tournament at Memphis. Well, that's a high level
Right.
summer amateur tournament.
That's right.
That Bermuda grass is the ideal surface for elite level amateur competitions in the summer in this region.
Yeah. Of course, Rodney was there.
And Rodney was there, right? And same thing here. Now with the priority of this club for elite high level amateur. I mean, you're going to hope I think it's the U.S. Girls Junior or the U.S. Women's Am.
U.S. Women's Am.
U.S. Women's Am is here in August. I mean, that's high level elite amateur play. Like that needs to be on Bermuda grass as an event in August. So yeah, it's always I think grass selection will be something that'll be debated here years after the both of us are long gone. They'll debate grass selection, particularly for putting greens, forever.
When we had bent grass greens here, you didn't have the hydroponic system available that you've got now too.
Yeah.
But of course, the utilities cost of that is way up there too. But it is a difference maker. They can really cool the temperatures down, and that makes a huge difference on bent grass. There's no question about it.
For sure. And I think, I get curious too about, are we at a moment where you think back to that time where, you were making trips out to Memphis to learn and then putting different cultivars out on the putting green back behind the clubhouse. Well, those were the latest cultivars, right? And that was the product of kind of iteration and development in Bermuda grass. And one of the things I'm curious about is that, will that swing the other way now that we have so many new bent grasses, and the Bermuda grass landscape has largely, I mean, we have Mach 1 as a new cultivar and TIFF 3D, but I think people are slower to adopt things that are truly, truly new. With the bent grasses in general, you probably have 10 of them, or maybe more if you bring in blends that give people more options, and maybe we'll see a switch that direction.
Certainly in places that are marginal for Bermuda grass.
Yeah.
And I consider Nashville to be marginal. Now, I grew up in Middle Tennessee, and it's a lot colder there than it is in Chattanooga in the wintertime.
And they're feeling that
That
this
is
year.
for sure. In fact, it's even colder in Nashville in the winter than it is in Knoxville.
Yeah.
So when they first started putting in Bermuda greens in Nashville, I was wondering if that would work. And they have had more problems there because it's a warm season grass and it gets damaged by cold weather. There's no question. Now, I doubt if bent grass will come back to Chattanooga, but places further north that have Bermuda grass and it suffers some, and they have the funds to put in the systems that grow better bent grass, you could possibly see bent grass reclaiming some of those areas.
Yeah, for sure. It'll be fun to watch.
Absolutely.
For sure. Well, it's not every day, David, you get to sit down with a Hall of Famer. You sign HOF after your name. I know you're a Tennessee golf. You're too modest. You're too modest. You should. You should start signing David Stone HOF, or at least mark your ball that way for
First off, nobody asked for my autograph anyway.
Well, but seriously, thank you for your time. Thank
Sure.
you for facilitating this venue at the honors to sit down and be on site and chat with you. And thanks for coming on Turf Tuesdays.
And go Big Orange.
All right.